and thank you very much to ICTD for the honour of inviting me to give this talk. I'll start with a question. My theme is the international tax system, but I think first of all we have to ask, well, is there an international tax system, and if so, why do we need one? From the point of view of fiscal sociology, taxes are the foundation of the national state, national sovereignty. And fiscal sociologists have analysed the historical development of tax states through, particularly focusing on developed countries, through to the establishment of what in fiscal sociology is described as the fiscal state, the state based on broad legitimation of both taxation and control of expenditure, and as emerging towards the end of the 19th century, as I say, particularly in developed countries, and particularly linked with the emergence of broad general taxation of income. And it was that fiscal state that propelled particularly developed countries during the 20th century to establish both great capacities both of social welfare but also warfare. Taxation increased significantly during the two great war periods, and its efficacy did as well, but also welfare arrangements so that tax to GDP rose during the 20th century in developed countries from I think around 9–10% through to now an average in OECD countries of getting on for 40%, but masking quite big differences, as you all know. On the other hand, in colonial or dependent countries, we've had a rather different trajectory. Obviously, being in that colonial or dependent context, both their economies were much more dependent, their insertion into the world economy was very different, but also from a tax point of view, what was established was much more like what we might describe as a tribute state, so that in the post-colonial context it's been quite difficult to establish that same concept of a fiscal state, the tributes. The forms of taxation, obviously it's difficult to generalise, but the forms of taxation in colonial or dependent countries were generally based either on levies on natural resources or property taxes, or land tax levies on land or hut or head taxes. So that I think they were experienced by populations in very different ways, which perhaps helps to explain the difficulty in post-colonial context of establishing a broader base of taxation. That's just to summarise broadly that taxes seem very linked to the nation state. Broadly speaking, the international tax system, I like to say, has these three components. Firstly, there's a skeleton. The skeleton is provided by this network of now mostly bilateral tax treaties. We now have a few multilateral treaties, and I was pleased to hear that ATAF is working on a multilateral treaty for mutual administrative assistance. So if that's the basic institutional skeleton, I like to say the flesh is put on the bones from a lawyer's point of view at any rate, because the model treaties, as I'm sure many of you know, if you've read the text, are really rather thin. They just state broad principles. But what developed was a system of commentaries on the treaties. And the commentaries, which are important in interpreting the meaning, are much more elaborate. So they put much more flesh on the bones of international tax rules. And beyond that also, there are often important reports, particularly from the OECD's Fiscal Committee, and especially in the area of transfer pricing. We have now the OECD guidelines on transfer pricing, which are not formally part of the commentaries to the treaties, although many of the principles in the guidelines are also repeated or echoed in the commentaries. But all of that adds to a body, from a legal point of view, we call the jurisprudence, if you like, of international tax. And then that's at the international level, but obviously then there's need to be implemented in national law. So there are various mechanisms within national states to incorporate or to implement both treaties, but also often either the commentaries or the guidelines. The OECD guidelines themselves have this rather indeterminate status. They're not an international treaty. They are commentaries, but they're nevertheless regarded as authoritative. In the UK, in fact, we have a rather ambivalent provision in our International Tax Act now, which says that as far as possible, British treaties, insofar as they've incorporated the principles, should be read so as to be consonant with the OECD transfer pricing guidelines, which for a lawyer is, well, I'm sure even for non-lawyers is a rather interesting concept. But thirdly, okay, that's a skeleton and that's maybe a little bit of flesh, but really what makes the international system work is the community of experts, basically. And that's been so since the beginning. As I say, when the League of Nations started in 1928, a couple of committees produced reports. One was a committee rather more of academic experts, and the other was of national tax officials.